Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us in this unique iteration of Spark. I'm really happy that you've tuned in. My name is Igor Popov. I'm the chief economist at Apartment List, and I have the privilege of leading our research team. And let me tell you, it has been a wild year in the world of housing economics research, and I want to share with you a lot of the data we've been uncovering, reading about, generating and unearthing throughout this past year. You know, it was a year in which I think for researchers, the research questions somewhat simplified and focused. You know, the grand nuance went out the window as we all tried to make sense of what was happening in real time to get our footing. But now we're at this point, I think, where we're really shifting a bit to this period where everyone's asking about what's next. I think that actually what I really want to talk about today is how I think that this next period as we are coming out of the pandemic, as the housing markets rebound and change and shift, the rapid pace of change, I think, is not going to slow down. And I'm going to try to share some of the data that at least I think are the closest thing we have to a bit of a simulation of a crystal ball. So I'm really happy you joined us for this session today. Thank you. In order to prepare for this virtual talk, I actually revisited the presentation I gave at Spark last year. I dug up this old photo of myself. I look young and naive and maskless and non-virtual. But you know, in looking back through the presentation from last year, which was the very beginning of March 2020, I think two things really struck me. One, we were already all talking about the trends that would end up being important throughout the pandemic and throughout this wild year. But at the same time, it was clear that we just had no idea how transformative the pandemic would be in the world of real estate, in the workforce, in the economy. Nevertheless, I think that what is next is not going to be any different in terms of the rapid pace of change, as I mentioned. I think we're just entering into a point where it's becoming clear there's no snapback to the 2010s that's going to happen, right? We know that this is going to be a unique period, and I think there's going to be real dynamic rebound and resorting in the housing market, and that's going to take a few forms. So let me break down what I want to talk about today in particular. Really, three big topics are on my mind right now, and the team and I have been working diligently on throughout these recent months. You know, first topic, I want to talk about remote work and the real pendulum swing and acceleration we have seen in the rise of remote work. You know, it's something we talked about last year, actually, and we thought it was a big deal. Then in the 2010s, we saw 76% growth in people working from home. But what we saw in this past year just blew that out of the water. I think that's going to have massive repercussions for what happens next. Number two, I want to talk about the shifting demand for cities. This is a theme that if you've heard me talk before, I know I'm almost obsessed with, but how people relate to cities and how cities evolve will be a very important theme, I think, in the next iteration of the housing market. And all of that will be happening, number three, in this context of regime change, I think, in terms of policy and technology. So that's where I want to dive into next. But let's start here. Let's start with this, what I think is really a new equilibrium we're about to see in remote work. You know, to some degree, you know, if COVID-19 was COVID 1990, the economy would have come to a much more severe halt. But we had already seen some early adoption of remote work, of working from home, of technologies that enabled it, that essentially meant that the companies that were able to become virtual had to run the experiment, had to see what it was like. I personally live this firsthand, right? As kind of seeing it from both sides as both a researcher and as someone trying to work out the kinks of leading a team remotely. We've been trying to find out how to do a great job of keeping and evolving our Apartment List culture as we go into a remote work setting. It has been a tremendous experience on both ends. We are actually all about it. We're going all in on a virtual first approach, even once it's safe to come back to offices. But what's also become very clear to us in our research is that this is not just an Apartment List or a technology sector phenomenon. This is really widespread. One thing we can do we can categorize all of the occupations and all the jobs that people hold throughout the economy and see, which ones can possibly be done remotely. What we find in that exercise, here's a bubble plot of every occupation by its size, grouped by, can it theoretically be done in a remote capacity, or does it require being on site at a client site, at an office, or somewhere else that needs a particular location for that job to happen? 30% of jobs in the United States could theoretically be done remotely. And that is about roughly the share that in surveys other researchers have noted of the employees that have been working remotely throughout the pandemic. But two main points I want to make on this. One, 30% is the national number, but in some markets it is much higher, in some markets it's much lower. If we look at a market like San Jose, in San Jose, actually 46% of the jobs in San Jose can be done remotely. So there is a massive opportunity for disruption in which cities people are really preferring based on whether or not they actually need to tie their jobs to that city or not. This is, of course, kind of one thing is what happens during the pandemic. A whole other thing is, again, what's going to happen next. We recently ran a survey, 5,000 Americans, a broadly representative study, where among the remote workers in the sample, those people that were working remotely as of 3 weeks ago, how many expected their employer to offer them some form of remote flexibility going forward? 4 in 10 of the respondents that were currently working remotely, kind of in a pandemic era, said that they actually expect their employer to possibly let them keep doing so in the future. So this is going to be a key factor for what happens next. And I think in some ways the cat is out of the bag in that sense. Once the toddler destroys the fully built Lego set, you're going to lose pieces. You're not going to recreate the whole thing. Once that flexibility, that entropy is out in the marketplace, I don't think it's really fully coming back to, again, the 2010s office-based economy growth. Now, broadly remote workers, that I think what I hopefully just demonstrated is a broad, section of society that may be working remotely into the 2020s. However, I think we need to get a little more specific if we're going to talk about how remote work is going to affect the housing market. How is it going to affect the rental market? How is it going to affect you and the operations of your businesses? So this is where we try to put on our, some of our economic lens onto the problem and think, well, who is actually most likely to move as a result of remote work? Who is most likely to actually be a net new mover if they are offered the opportunity to work remotely? We hypothesize basically that the answer to that is the people that are going to move if they are able to work remotely are going to be the people with the lowest cost of moving, or the biggest, essentially decrease in their cost of moving as a result from being able to work remotely. And that's where we came upon this kind of classification. We coined this term, the untethered class is how we think of them. There is a group of people out there in today's economy for whom their job is the only thing really tethering them to their city. Aside from their job, which maybe can be done remotely, there's nothing else that's really making it hard for them to get up and move to a new place. So what is an untethered, who is a member of the untethered class? We define this as someone who is in a job that can be done remotely, one, is not tethered by home ownership, so doesn't need to sell a house in order to move, is a renter, and is not tethered by either school-aged children or a spouse that needs to work at an on-site location. So a spouse that can either work remotely or no working partner. Now, these are people, again, for whom if their employer said, hey, you can go live wherever you want, there is basically nothing that's making it super costly for them to move. So we think this is a very interesting group because they will basically be the first remote work movers as we are coming out of the pandemic. And what do we find? So 6% of employed Americans fit this definition of the untethered class. And Maybe you think that's a big number, maybe you think that's a small number. When you narrow into a group of people who have been very important for the growth of the rental market in the past 10 years, and those are high-income renters, essentially, and we talked about this last year together, in the last 10 years, high-income renters have been responsible for the vast majority of the growth in the rental market. It turns out that 1 in 4 high-income renters are part of this untethered class, meaning 1 in 4 renters that are making 6-figure salaries in their household have basically a job that can be done remotely, and they don't have a spouse or school-age children tying them to their location, making it costly for them to move. So I think really if we want to figure out what the effect of remote work is going to be on housing market, we kind of need to start with these people that are going to be the first movers because it is least costly for them to move. So that's where we're going to go from here. And we actually recently had this collaboration with the team at Bloomberg City Lab, where we took our definition of untethered workers and we're able to match it up with some data they had actually from the US Postal Service change of address requests. So this is a great backward-looking measure of mobility and movement. And what you see here is basically we plot the share of people in a city that are part of this untethered class against the growth over the past year in the number of moves out of that city. And we see this stark positive correlation. That's looking backwards. We also wanted to generate some survey data, some evidence to look forward as well. So that's where, again, we go back to this survey we recently ran. I mean, this is pretty hot off the presses. It's a couple weeks old. So we're looking at people who, based on whether or not they expect to continue to work remotely, whether or not they expect to be on site, or whether or not they're fully part of this untethered class, we ask people essentially, are you planning a move in the next year? So it's April 2021. If we look ahead to the spring of 2022, how likely is it that you're going to be living somewhere else? So here's what we found. Remote workers are, and not just remote workers, but those that expect that their employers will continue to offer them some remote work flexibility are significantly more likely to move in the next year than those that need to be at an office or need to be at an on-site location. Especially, they're 65% more likely to make a move. They're 45% more likely to make a cross-city move. And similarly, if we actually look at this group of untethered workers, they are even more likely to be planning to make a move. They are actually twice as likely as someone who expects to work on site to be planning a move over the next year. And these numbers are pretty large. Not all of these moves are going to happen, but I think this is really important because if we want to figure out where the heat is going to be in the housing market in the near future, I think a lot of that action is going to be determined by, the question of who's going to make these net new moves and where are they going to move to? What are going to be the markets that are drawing in new people that they wouldn't otherwise draw in? I think this gives us an early answer. It's going to be these remote workers. It's going to be especially the remote workers for whom, again, their job was the thing tying them to their city. This leads to a very natural next question, right? The next question I think we all want to ask is, okay, well, what do these people like? Where are they going to move? If they are planning to make a move, what are they thinking about? What's going into their decision making about their next move? And this is where, this question of what types of places people working remotely enjoy, it had sort of an answer during the pandemic. There was all of this talk of Zoom towns, right? We heard about kind of small towns that were situated near a lot of natural beauty. And we heard a lot of discussion of Zoom towns. It was essentially a term popularized over the past 6 months. I think it's important, though, and the reason we wanted to dig in a little further, it's not obvious at all that the places that people liked during the pandemic are going to be the same as the places that people are going to like coming out of the pandemic, right? And so that's where one of the things that we asked in this broadly representative survey, again, thousands of Americans, we asked people to essentially tell us if they were planning to make a move, what are the factors that are most important to you in your move, and what's the factor that's maybe the least important? And this is what I'm actually showing on this slide, but in particular, this is for remote workers who are at least somewhat likely to make a move over the next 3 years. So these are the people who are going to determine kind of where the heat and the action gets redistributed in the housing market. What do they say is important to them? It turns out the number one most important factor, as they say, the respondents say in the surveys, is access to a housing market where they can afford home ownership. Now, I think this has something to do with the fact that a lot of these untethered workers have been in pretty expensive markets in recent years. It also tells you that some of the more affordable, maybe smaller metros are likely to see a continued boom from some of these remote workers getting redistributed to new markets, essentially redistributing some of the action in the U.S. housing market. Now, broadly though, this is a very diverse list. There are multiple things that are on people's minds as they are remote workers that are trying to figure out where to live next. In basically a close tie for third, we see access to natural amenities. That leads you towards the Zoomtown kind of atmosphere. We see access to urban amenities. So we might see a lot of remote workers that actually want to be in cities once they get the flexibility. And also access to family continues to be very important. Okay, so that's about preferences of remote workers and the untethered class. Some might move to more affordable markets, more affordable suburbs, smaller metros. Some might move to cities. I think that throughout the pandemic, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about cities today is we heard a lot of discussion and debate around the future of cities. Someone would write something on the death of New York. Jerry Seinfeld would write something about how no one should think about the death of New York, and so on times 1,000. But this question of what will happen with urbanization, I think, is really important. I think we know, right, that there was increasing demand for urban amenities leading up to the pandemic. We knew that in the multifamily, there was a lot of investment in places, in communities, in walkable neighborhoods, in community level amenities. So to some degree, we know that was paused, but I think what happens next could be a pretty nuanced story. Looking backwards, I think what we saw throughout 2020 was that location just started to matter less. So normal times, places that are near things that people want to be near, they have a high premium. Places that are far away from stuff people like, they come at a discount. And as a lot of our entertainment and work either disappeared or went online, those premiums and those discounts disappeared. We saw a massive convergence in rents throughout the country. What I'm showing here is basically on the y-axis, how expensive was your city going into the pandemic in March 2020? And that's on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, how much did your rent change throughout the course of the pandemic since March 2020? And we see that basically the more expensive a market was going into the pandemic, the faster rents fell in those markets, with the outliers being San Francisco and New York City. And the more affordable a market was going into the pandemic, actually the most affordable markets, they got more expensive throughout the course of the pandemic. Again, largely because I think that location premium really went away, or that location discount, depending on where someone was. The other big shift we saw, again, talking about cities versus suburbs, they had very different rent trajectories throughout the course of the pandemic. So this is building off of our rent estimates. We just break up our rent estimates by principal cities, so the core city in every metro, and let's take a weighted average across the 30 largest metros. And let's take the surrounding cities, the suburbs of each of those core cities. And we actually see, one thing I take from this chart, you see that the demand fell for urban amenities based on the fact that rents in principal cities fell pretty dramatically. You also see that there were probably millions of suburban renters that were reading these articles about rents falling and saying, what are they talking about? Our rents have not fallen at all. And when you look at what's happening in 2021, we basically see a reacceleration of rent growth across both. So now cities are heating up and suburbs are continuing to heat up. Now, we see this big decline in prices in principal cities, but I mean, does that mean that these cities were hollowing out, that no one was moving to these cities, that no one was searching for apartments in these cities? Actually, no. This is where I'm sorry to be an economist here, but I have to kind of talk about prices and quantities. This is what's happening with prices, but quantities are a whole other thing entirely. And one of the ways in which we look at that is in our search data. One of the things that we did was categorize all of our searches. Every search has an origin and a destination. For people moving within their city, you can think of those as being in the same place. But we can categorize all of our search activity on Apartment List, based on, is the origin or the destination more dense? Is someone looking to move to something that's maybe more dense, or think of it more urban, more city-like, or are they trying to do the opposite? So Q1 2020, a little bit over 40%, 41% of searches on Apartment List that were moving across city lines were moving to some place that was more dense. That, is to some degree, it might be a measure for, another measure of a preference for urbanization, but we actually saw that increase throughout the course of the pandemic. There were actually more people searching to move to more dense cities by the end of 2020 than there were at the start. And it's especially accelerated by Q3. And I think one of the things we saw was that maybe cities got less attractive as urban amenities, concerts, karaoke, bars shut down, but they also got cheaper. And a lot of people started to look at those places that maybe were priced out previously. And so what we saw was, not an exodus, but really just a big remix of who was living in these cities based on what they wanted. We also track amenity preferences, and a lot of more recent multifamily construction has been investing heavily in these community level amenities. I would have thought that demand for pools and gyms would plummet during a pandemic. That's actually not really what we saw. We saw that actually by and large, there's some regional differences, there's some individual city differences, but by and large, amenity preferences didn't change tremendously. So there are still people out there that are looking for pools, that are still people out there that are looking for gyms. I think the one thing that we did see change somewhat dramatically, at least, if you look at our amenity data, you do get the sense that a lot of people adopted pets. So pet friendliness, I think, is going to be at a big premium. So lots of new cats and dogs in the apartment rental market. But if you had certain amenities prior to the pandemic, and those amenities are very likely to still be in high demand. There's also a preference for flexibility that plays into all this. I think one of the reasons we expect another interesting reshuffle in the rental market in the coming months is that we saw a big increase in the demand for short-term leases throughout the course of the pandemic. And this was especially driven by people leaving large, expensive urban centers. So a lot of people all of a sudden were out there in the marketplace trying to sign, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 month leases in the second half of 2020, especially among people that were leaving places like San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, Chicago. And now all of those people, all of those short-term leases are going to be coming up, and that demand is going to be back into the market, possibly because a lot of these people weren't certain if they actually wanted to leave these cities, or maybe were somewhat certain that they wanted to come back. Maybe they put their things in storage, but that demand, I think, is going to be back in urban markets, alongside the new people that kind of moved in based on the deals that they were getting during the second half of 2020. And so, we saw a big divergence in rents at the early part of 2020, but now, when we look to what's next, we really see that cities are accelerating their rent growth, and there's a lot of heat in cities. Suburbs are continuing to accelerate their rent growth. Zoom towns are continuing to accelerate rent growth. And all of this is really coming together to create a very hot market. We have seen the biggest increases, monthly increases in our rent indices over the past 2 months that we have seen since we started providing these estimates. And so I think that this means that how do we think about this question of urbanization? I think urban cores are really bracing for another shuffle this coming summer, another rearrangement of who's living there, especially as I think a lot of the people that moved in for the deals, they're going to see their rents grow significantly as the market really will be in a much different spot by the time their leases are up. So, I've talked a lot about urbanization, remote work. I just want to end on a couple of quick notes to kind of remind us all of just the context that these trends in remote work and urbanization are really sitting in. And I think especially, I'm thinking about policy change, which I think will happen very quickly in the coming years, and technology change. When I think about policy change, you can't talk about the rise of remote work without also hinting at least, or discussing, or really delving into understanding the effect that that's going to have on inequality throughout the United States. Something many people were concerned about going into the pandemic, but there is a very stark relationship between who can work from home and incomes, right? And so this is one plot that we made pretty early on in sort of the quarantine era, where we group each occupation by plotted against what share of people in that occupation live below the poverty line, and what share of people in that occupation are able to work from home. Basically see that there are occupations in 3 of the 4 quadrants, but there's essentially no occupation that is remote friendly and high poverty, right? It is really amazing. The closest thing we see are artists are a little bit of an outlier there, but these inequality concerns that are really accelerated throughout the course of the pandemic due to this, really relationship between who could continue working during an era of social distancing and who could not, and what their incomes were going into the pandemic. I think this is going to be something that policymakers are going to take a really close look at. And it's going to be, I think we're already seeing a quick pace of change in economic policy. And I think that's going to continue to affect the housing market in important ways. So none of these changes in preferences are going to happen in a vacuum. So I'll end though on a piece of good news that I also want to, highlight, as I've been talking a lot about remote work, and some people kind of doubt this acceleration of remote work because either they've had bad experiences with it or don't believe that it can be done effectively. I think the other thing that I kind of want to close on, because I know I've talked a lot about this reacceleration of remote work is never going to be as bad as it is today, right? The acceleration of technological development for the kind of challenges that this massive class of remote workers is going to face, it's going to be immense. And so the improvements, I think, that we don't even necessarily understand yet are going to also transform how easy it is to work remotely, that I think is going to reaccelerate a lot of the trends that we've been talking about throughout this half hour. Let's take one issue we already see, your brain on Zoom, right? So this, some researchers at Microsoft basically took some poor employee volunteers and put EEG caps on them to measure stress levels, and then put them through back-to-back Zoom meetings. And the top panel is, if you don't give them any breaks, how stressed out do their brains get? And you see, you kind of harbor this immense amount of stress, sitting into these video calls. But we have not yet, by the way, until about meeting 4, where they just give up entirely and stop caring. But the key point though is that no one has really tackled these problems from either a management or a next level of technology change standpoint. But I think they will now. There's a massive need in the market. And so I also think that the experience of remote work will be very different in just a few years than it is today, which I think will again, reaccelerate many of the trends that I've been chatting through today. So, in terms of what's next, I know I've talked through some of the key themes. We're in for a busy summer of a remix in the housing market again, but the one thing I'm pretty certain of is as we look forward to maybe a future spark when we're together and look back at this talk, I think we'll certainly marvel at the amount of change that has happened since this talk, just the way we look back on 2020 and marvel at how different the world was back then. Again, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Please, I love talking about this stuff, so would love to connect with questions, follow-up discussions, data deep dives, and hope to see you all very soon. Take care.